Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. I'm Paul Saunders. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for the National Interest, for those whom I have not previously met. Thanks for joining us on this cold day in Washington, which I understand actually is even colder than Moscow at this point. That's quite an accomplishment for all of us here. I won't give a long substantive introduction of the topic. I think it's obvious why it's an interesting and important topic given the role of the Russian energy sector in Russia's economy and international role. We're very pleased to have with us from Moscow Dr. Tatiana Mitrova, who heads the Oil and Gas Department at the Energy Research Institute of the Russian Academy of Sciences, and is also teaching in Moscow and this semester even in Paris at Sciences Po, which we all talked about already as a delightful place to be in the spring semester. Tatiana is one of Russia's top energy economists and very regularly is a study director and a lead author on major Russian studies, Russia's energy outlooks, Russian energy strategy documents. So we're very much looking forward to hearing what she has to say. We're also very pleased to have with us Charles Ebinger and Frank Verrastro. Charlie Ebinger, of course, senior fellow on energy issues at the Brookings Institution with I think more than 3 decades of experience in the private sector and also some experience in the U.S. government, advising American companies, advising huge multilateral development banks and other big lenders, and certainly a leading authority on the international energy situation. As is Frank Verrastro, who is Senior Vice President and Schlesinger Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And here at the Center for the National Interest, we have a particular affinity for Jim Schlesinger, who was a founding board member, actually, of the Center, and a great loss to all of us. Frank also decades of experience in government, in the White House, the Energy Department, the Interior Department, as well as out of government. We will just go from, I guess, your left to right, this direction, starting with Tatiana. I've asked each person to speak for about 10 minutes. Please.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and it's really a great pleasure for me to be here, and thank you for coming. It's a huge challenge to tell you the whole story of the Russian energy sector in 10 minutes, so you will get only the major messages, and then I hope we will have an opportunity to discuss more in details the things which are of major interest for you. But for the beginning, one very important historical remark. Actually, the slowdown of the Russian economic development and the slowdown of the domestic energy demand and exports started well before the geopolitical crisis we observe currently in Ukraine. So it was already 2012, 2013 that we saw slowing down GDP growth rates, slowing down industrial output. Energy exports dropped significantly first in 2009 as the economic crisis came to Europe, and actually it was mainly European exports which were hit. And actually the process which we are observing now, which is characterized by even lower GDP, most likely we will have negative GDP this year and ruble depreciation and quite shaky industrial output. It is more a prolongation of those trends when the old economic model actually exhausted itself. Even with $110 per barrel oil, it was already obvious that the economy is not growing any longer. And so currently I can see many talks that it's the result of the sanctions, it's the result of the low oil prices. Frankly, no. It was already created by the previous activities or lack of activity in diversification of the economy, or finding any other driver for its growth except for petrodollars. At the same time, I would say it's also a very frequent question whether the sanctions are affecting somehow energy sector. I would say that the implications are very, very limited. So yes, Arctic projects are postponed, but frankly nobody expected Arctic oil to deliver any significant volumes to the Russian oil production before 2030. So it's about very long-term perspective. Titan shale oil, Bazhenov rock development, yes, it's slowing down, though not stopped completely. It's slowing down, but again, it's the same story. It was a very long-term investment expected to deliver the first fruits in 15 to 20 years. So currently it's not affecting Russian oil production at all. Moreover, results of 2013 are showing some tiny growth in the oil output, like 0.1%, very symbolic. Yeah. Actually, the problems which Russian oil sector in particular is facing, they are inherited from the previous years. It's mainly about taxation system. It's mainly about huge centralization of the industry, with Rosneft currently controlling already like 50% of the oil output, which means that small and independent oil companies, which are usually the drivers of innovation and smaller field development, they are finding themselves in a very difficult situation. And with the financial sanctions implications, yeah, they are creating troubles for Russian energy companies in obtaining finance on the global market, especially for those which are under direct sanctions like Rosneft, like Novatek. But at the same time, so far they've managed to receive quite significant state support. Yeah, and the level of their debts, especially for Rosneft, which is characterized by the highest debt ratio, it is actually, even under the low oil prices, they are generating sufficient cash flow to get through it. So I wouldn't expect any threat of Rosneft bankruptcy or something like that, even without state support. So it's a difficult time for the company, but it's not something which could destroy it. Concerning the other branches of the Russian energy sector, like gas industry, electricity industry, they are also facing challenges. First of all, the major challenge, amazingly, is the flat domestic demand. So all the projections, all the investment plans, they were made assuming economic growth, which stopped. And so currently we have like 25 gigawatt of excess capacity on the power market. And so it's difficult. All the nuclear program, for example, which assumed huge new nuclear blocks construction, it's questioned now because these new nuclear capacities will squeeze away from the market new, quite efficient thermal generation. There is not enough space, there is not enough domestic demand for both of them. Renewables are in complete disaster because there is no space for them in the market, and actually there was this system of green tariffs created and a capacity market which obliged to pay for renewable capacities, but now it's becoming more and more difficult to sustain this system with such low electricity demand. And with the gas market, amazingly, after so many years when we were talking about gas deficit, currently we've got a huge gas glut, which is estimated at about 110, 140 billion cubic meters of gas. And Novatek, Rosneft, they have very aggressive plans to increase further their gas production. It's mainly associated gas in case of Rosneft, so it's not their choice, they have to do it. Novatek is targeted at increased gas condensate production, which is major part of their revenues. So again, gas is coming more like a byproduct, yeah, which means that they will not reduce their production plans. And there is not enough room in the domestic market for all this gas. So the competition between Gazprom, Rosneft, and Novatek is increasing, is becoming really, really tough. It's more like a price war already. And assuming that after the ruble depreciation, domestic gas prices in dollar term dropped twice, you can imagine that it's becoming the question of survival for the gas companies, who will actually manage to protect his market niche. There are many discussions about revision of the gas market model. So Rosneft is promoting the idea of Gazprom unbundling, of course. Gazprom doesn't agree with this idea, definitely. So we are going to see quite a turbulent time on the domestic gas market. Gas exports to Europe dropped additional 9% in 2014. So, and it seems that this year won't be more optimistic for Russian gas export westwards. Gas deal with China was a very, very important step in the gas export diversification, and the deal was reached in May 2014. Immediately negotiations started about Altai project, which could bring gas from western Siberia to northwestern part of China. But so far only a framework agreement was signed, which is similar to the agreement signed on Power of Siberia like 10 years ago. So then it took 10 years to get the final deal done. So it's only the beginning of the process, and anyway, the Power of Siberia construction would take 5 years, and then additional 5 years before you can bring the pipeline to its full capacity. So actually these 38 BCM of gas from eastern Siberia to China will start to flow on the full scale only by 2023, 2025, about this period of time. So before that, Russia is strongly dependent on European market, and even after that, the dependence, so 38 going to the east and about 140, 150 going to the west. You can see the difference. Of course, Europe is remaining the major market, and the problem is that nor Europe is interested in increasing Russian gas exports, nor China actually is showing any strong enthusiasm in expanding these import capacities, which means that this huge bubble, gas bubble oversupply of the domestic market will exist, increasing further this rivalry between gas-producing companies. So the time is not easy at all. There are many challenges facing, but generally speaking, the situation is not more significantly more difficult than it used to be like a year ago. Low oil prices, they are undermining state budget, but not the oil companies, simply because of very specific design of the Russian taxation system. When the major, so for oil companies, it doesn't matter whether the oil price is $100 per barrel or $50 per barrel, because it's state take. So the budget suffers, but the oil companies, they are receiving nearly the same netback from their oil supplies. They are going to cut down some of their investment programs because it's a good pretext to refer to the low oil prices, but these are the most difficult, challenging, expensive and low efficient projects. So in this respect, together with sanctions, frankly speaking, I'm completely concerned that it's the aspect where we have to thank sanctions, because they've actually made a sort of sanation of the projects in the industry. postponing the most expensive and the less efficient projects which would not deliver any added value to the industry and which were more like ambitions rather than economic efficiency. So oil industry itself, under the current technological and financial sanctions, feels itself more or less sustainable, not worse than it was a year ago. Gas industry, the same story actually. It's not a target to sanctions, and it didn't start yet to feel the decline of gas prices, because there is a time lag between the oil price and the gas price, so it will reach us only in April or May, yeah, which will definitely lead to the declining revenues of Gazprom and declining state budget revenues. So according to investment analysts, they could drop from $35 billion to $18 billion just because of the oil price decline. But nevertheless, the situation doesn't seem like terrible, and I wouldn't say that. I mean, many people are asking, is the Russian economy ready to collapse? No, it's not. Not at all. And Russian energy sector, so far, it's not easy, but it is surviving. It's showing more or less sustainable functioning. Though, of course, we do not know how the political situation will evolve and whether there will be some additional sanctions. So it could go far worse. Yeah. And the major question for the Russian government is how long the oil price will stay where it is. The major expectation is that it will recover soon, because nobody's happy with low prices. But who knows? Okay, I'll stop on that.
Okay, thank you very much, Tatiana. Charlie.
Boy, that's a hard act to follow. I thought things were bad in the U.S., or maybe they're worse in Russia. What I'm going to try to do is place against what Tatiana has very well delineated as the Russian situation, what I think is happening in the broader international market and what that may portend for prices looking forward, and particularly maybe not with quite the impact as she's highlighted because of the way the government splits the revenue with the oil companies in Russia, but why I think it's very likely that we have not seen the bottom of this market and that we will test much lower prices before we see higher prices. Although I say that with a great deal of humility. Actually, Paul, I realized as of January, it's now 4 decades that I've looked at this, but I haven't become any wiser as a result. And anyone who professes to have a crystal ball should do so only with great humility and great peril. Let me just quote, because I think it's a wonderful quote and kind of summarizes some of the absurdities we see coming out of various institutions today. A quote by Ruchir Sharma, who says, "The old rule of forecasting was to make as many forecasts as possible and publicize the ones you got right. The new rule is to forecast so far in the future, no one will know you got it wrong." And while that's said with some degree of humor, I think there's a lot of merit to that. With all the debate about what is happening in the oil market, I think we've lost some fundamental observations about what has been happening for a long time that is, in my belief, transforming the global market. And I mean by that the reality has been that if we look at primary fuel demand across fuels, that actually oil has been losing global market share for the last 11 years. Non-OECD demand, which comprises about 47% of global demand, is up 25% since 1970. That sounds like a good story for prices. But on the other hand, OECD oil consumption is down nearly 3.6 million barrels a day to the same levels that prevailed in 2005. There is essentially no growth in the OECD for all intents and purposes for oil. Oil demand in the power and industrial sectors around the world has been clobbered if we look at data for the last 10 to 12 years. And where, if there is any growth market, where it has to be is in transportation, where already 50% of the world's oil is used in transportation. And while this percentage is in emerging markets is rising, in the OECD it has fallen 60%, and as more fuel economy standards ripple through the system, will fall further. And just yesterday I met with a leading Chinese energy observer who shared with me, one person's view, but shared with me that their institute at the National Academy of Sciences believes very strongly that the growth projections for automobiles in China will not come to pass, that between concerns about growing pollution, high taxation on automobiles, actually banning driving on odd, even days in certain Chinese cities, that the people who are projecting huge transportation demand, it may occur over time, but not in the early time frame that a lot of people have said. We've also seen the slashing of fuel subsidies around the world in countries like India, Indonesia, China, Thailand, Pakistan, and others. And while that may not seem like a big thing in this or that country, if you realize how those cheap prices have led to much higher demand than the market would ordinarily dictate if market prices had prevailed, as these are eliminated, this is not good news for anybody projecting large rises in energy demand in the emerging markets to offset declining markets elsewhere. I think we also, if you look at some hard data, you'll see that fuel efficiency programs around the world, not just in the United States, not just in Europe or Japan, but are creating lasting structural changes in the size and nature of the market. And these will not go away and are likely going to continue and take away more market share in the future. This next statement will probably generate some controversy, but I would assert that OPEC is losing control of the market. In '73, they had roughly 50% of the market share. Today it's down to 42%, and yet Gulf producers incur the lowest costs with huge financial reserves, so clearly they can last this out better than the rest of us. But between their own subsidy programs, which are beginning to bite quite directly into the export capacity of most of the Gulf oil producers, this is not a good story either. And were they to actually bite the bullet, and some have begun to, Abu Dhabi has begun to, for example, if they actually bite the bullet and raise prices, that of course will also lower the demand for oil. I won't go into Russia because Tatiana has done that far better than I could possibly do, but obviously Russia is a critical country, and despite the drop in exports that she highlighted, they are still a significant oil producer onto the market. And what happens in Russia in that vein in the future will also have a major impact. Now, that all said, that rather pessimistic view of the oil market already said, one has to say what could be different and make that forecast wrong, or at least one that needs to be tailored. First, if we look 10 years out, the impact of population growth and migration. We're still projecting, a world of 9+ billion people. Where's the energy going to come from to help those people? Technological breakthroughs such as the ability to raise unconventional production recovery rates, or serious changes in automotive technology. These could be game changers, particularly if you believe that with all the gas slushing around the world, and it is slushing around the world, what are the real prospects looking, not today, tomorrow, but 10, 20 years out? What are the prospects of LNG actually penetrating automotive fleets, marine fleets? We're beginning to see them penetrate railroad locomotives in North America. What will this mean for the demand for oil in those sectors? The further elimination of subsidies on fossil fuels, the growth of biofuels. I've always been a skeptic of biofuels, but I must say, as I start looking around the world and adding up little bits and pieces here and there, it's become quite a significant number, and also eating away at the demand for petroleum. What are the Japanese finally going to do about their nuclear program? How many reactors are going to come back, if more than the ones already potentially announced? That has a tremendous demand, if not directly on oil demand, a little bit on oil demand, but certainly on LNG demand. The impact of China's national pollution plan on local car sales and transportation. What I mentioned, the outright banning on certain days, odd even driving, which those of us my age can remember we actually had in the 70s here in the United States. A big issue totally off the map in most people's minds is the implementation of the new energy efficiency targets by the International Maritime Organization on bunker fuel demand, one of the dirtiest fuels, one of the biggest contributors to climate change, but also a huge user of petroleum-based fuels. And if those were sizably reduced, not a good story for demand on the oil front. And the re-entry, Frank always talks about this, and the fact that we still have an estimated 3.5 million barrels of oil that could be produced but is currently off the market because of various political conflicts around the world. What if even 1.5 million barrels of that were all of a sudden to surprise us and come back on the marketplace? Let me conclude by saying that I think that given the fact that there is basically no growth in demand today, almost no growth in Europe, almost no growth in Japan, falling economic growth in China. India perhaps is a bright spot on the market. It looks like we're getting a little uptick in demand in the United States in response to low gasoline prices, although the data is still very preliminary. But given this fact, I see little prospects of anything that will lead to a catalyst for sustained oil prices on the upside. I would assert that if you look at the upticks we've had from having tested the lows we've tested so far, that an awful lot of that is people putting oil into storage. At some point the storage remains full and either has to be drawn down as we move to different types of fuels on a seasonal basis. And if it is drawn down, then of course that means there's no new incremental demand beyond what has already been purchased and put into storage. So I would suspect that in the spring that there's a very strong prospect that we will see the lows of oil prices be tested. Now, other uncertainties that I think we need to ask ourselves, I kind of hinted at it, the discussion on China, but what is going to be the growth of the car fleet globally? Because as I mentioned, this is where big demand is going to be. We have roughly 900 million cars in the world today, and some people are still projecting 2 billion. But is that really going to be a reality given the problems that we've seen in China and India with pollution and growing political outrage at pollution and what it's doing to human health in those countries? What happens to the 1.2 billion people in the world who currently have no electricity if all of a sudden they get electricity, even a light bulb or two? What does that do to to energy demand? It may come from renewables, it may come from a variety of fuels, but it's a great unknown that often is left out of the equation when people are forecasting. Or what happens to the roughly 2.8 billion people in the world who still use primarily traditional fuels if they were to move into a commercial fuel market? What would that do to demand? So these are all great uncertainties. I wish I had answers for you, but I do think it's very hard to see the upside for petroleum demand that will drive prices back up. So I'll stick my neck out on a limb and say I think we'll test the upper 30s, but at some point those prices down at that level will in fact become the catalyst that resumes world economic growth, particularly in the large emerging market countries, and then we'll be back on an upward track. But I think it'll be a long, long time before we see $80+ in the market. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Frank.
Okay, so my work here is done. Let me touch on a couple of things. Paul talked about my government experience. Actually, 25 years, I spent time in government, but the bulk of my career was spent in the private sector. I was senior VP for Pennzoil, did upstream and downstream, international and domestic. And I want to go back to a couple of things Tatiana said. So 3 or 4 things on Russia. It's all about cash flow right now. I think for those companies, the way you drill wells and the way you set production plans, things that you put in place in 2012 and 2013, those are the volumes you see in 2014, 15, and 16. So once those revenues are committed, and the capital expenditures made, you're talking about OPEX, operating expenditures, and as long as you meet payroll, you're actually in reasonably good shape. So I think what you're going to see, and this is the reason that even in the United States, that people see a gradual slowdown, but probably not until the second half of this year, for those independent companies that had hedged a lot of their production. Last year, the hedging really stopped in July or August, and they're generally 12-month hedges. Those will be coming off this June. I don't know anyone that hedged for a higher price in September when prices were going down because they couldn't find a seller. So to the extent you thought that that was your buffer, that you had this higher price revenue, that's probably going to go away. So you're going to see that being tested. I think the same is true in Russia, that a lot of the commitments that were made keep going on. The distinction that was made on the sanctions between existing production and future production was tested when folks got to the definition of drilling into shales or through shales, and had it gone the other way, it would have impacted current production as well and drilling budgets. The slowdown, the IEA expects Russia to come off maybe 100,000 barrels this year, but not 500,000 barrels a day this year. The U.S. may come off because of loss of stripper wells, 300,000 or 400,000, but it just slows the trajectory of the increase. And you won't see that, I agree with Charlie, until at least after June. We're also running into what I would call seasonal issues that mask things, right? So refineries do turnaround maintenance both in the spring and in the fall. And what they do in those maintenance seasons is take the equipment down and change out their catalysts. So in the United States, they can produce more gasoline as we enter the driving season, and less gasoline, more heating oil and fuel oil in the fall. What you're seeing this year is because of either closures due to strikes or fires. Some people started maintenance a bit early. The bulk of the people decided that, when there was an uptick, if crude prices are down and product prices are still good, I'm going to stay open, and I will delay my maintenance until end of February, beginning of March. So until you get to April, April Fool's Day might be a good day, you'll actually see when people start emerging from turnaround and what that demand means. When we looked at last year, about midway through the year, we thought that the demand for the year on year, was overestimated. Some people called, as Charlie talked about, it was mostly coming from non-OECD. And they talked about 1,300,000 barrels a day of new demand, 2013 versus 2014. It was pretty obvious once we got to the summer that those estimates were way, way off. And the distinction between consumption and demand, so if you had a new refinery going into business, you started buying crude oil to get ready for it. If you built a new pipeline, you bought crude oil to fill the pipeline. If you were China and you bought oil for strategic storage, but that wasn't consumption. And about half past August, we realized those demand figures are awfully weak. And then we had to make it up in 6 months. We had to make up a year's oversupply in 6 months, so the prices were bound to fall. When we moved into the OPEC meeting, I don't know, the analysts that talked about OPEC shoring up and OPEC's traditional role, it was pretty apparent to us that the Saudis weren't going to cut unilaterally. That despite rumors to the contrary, Russia, Venezuela, Iraq, no one came to the Saudis and said, we'll help you cut to maintain prices. Everyone wanted them to reduce production by between 800,000 and 1.3 million to just prop up prices. And then they wanted the opportunity, if Libya came back, or Iran sanctions came off, or the U.S. was able to produce more, or Iraq was able to produce more, they wanted to move into the market to take market share, which would have required the Saudis to continue to reduce output to make room for other competitors. And then we get into the quality issue. So the U.S. has a lot of what we call light oil. The tight oil revolution, without getting too specific here, when you do fracking in oil reservoirs, in the gas reservoirs, the frack basically blows sand and water into shales like a power sprayer, creates holes and pore space, and then opens up evacuation routes so the gas that's in there under pressure is allowed to flow out. The size of the frack is probably the size of this pin, the pen top. When you do oil, the frack space is a little bit larger, so light oil flows easier than heavy oil. So the initial phases here has been, for us, light tight oil. But there's only so much of that you can use, because the only people that buy crude oil are refiners. And so this notion that the U.S. replaced Iran wasn't true. Saudis replaced Iran, U.S. replaced Libya. And in the process, we backed out Algerian, Angolan, Nigerian light oil, which used to come to the United States, which is now tried to go to Asia to find markets in Asia. So the notion that if we were allowed to export now, there'd be this volume, like 3 million barrels a day of U.S. light oil that would flood the market. I don't see it, because I don't know who would use it. You'd make more gasoline, and we talked about what's the real demand for gasoline, so I don't think that would happen. On the Russian side, and this is the kind of good news, right, is that the costs in Russia are denominated in rubles, but the price of oil is denominated in dollars. So those companies actually are paying a devalued ruble and getting intake of dollars, which actually helps them a bit. I do think that the financing is going to get more difficult, and as we get to Western banks and companies that have extra money, and if you're looking to someone like China to be the white knight, that's going to come with a huge expense. They will be opportunistic as they negotiate. In fact, the joke in our place was that if you were China, you wanted to negotiate the gas deal after the sanctions were announced, right? Not before. And I see that going forward. So 2015, a little bit of Russian production comes off. 2016, 2017, and I agree with Charlie, I think this continues a little bit longer, if for no other reason that we're oversupplying the market now. And if you look at the aspirational players out there, if Iran sanctions come off and they add 400,000 barrels a day of new production, and Iraq stabilizes, you know, inshallah, that they would add new production. On the flip side of that is we're doing a session tomorrow on Latin America, and the projections for when Venezuela could go south are like as soon as next Tuesday, and then maybe 6 months out. But there's been people that have been saying that for the last 5 years. Right? Nigeria is in the same boat. It's not a good situation. So if you start adding up the potential hotspots around the world that are also oil producers, you could see where a major disruption spikes prices. If we were to get a terrorist, even sabotage attack, not ISIS, but a single person in Basra, prices would spike. So it's a very fluid situation, but if you look at the fundamentals of supply and demand, we're producing a couple 100,000 barrels a day more than the world needs right now. And every day we do that, that adds to the overhang. Storage in the United States is at 85-year highs, and we're running out of above ground storage. So some of the independents, and there's two views of the world on this, but some of the independents are actually drilling wells and completing them, putting the casing in, but not completing the well at the end. And with the cycle time on this drilling, so they're actually storing oil in the borehole. We don't know what that number is, but they could bring it on pretty quickly. And the analogy I use is like the busboy that goes by your table and sees that your glass is half full, and he goes, there's an opportunity. Let me fill it up with some more water. If that happens, you continue these low prices. And we saw this with natural gas 3 years ago. Because of you have to produce to hold your lease, some of these contracts require that you will continue production as long as you're making cash flow and making your payroll. If you keep doing that, you keep oversupplying the market and the price goes down further. Now, the one potential bright spot is costs on the other side have escalated over the last 5 years, since we had $150 oil. And if the service sector could get their act together so that we could streamline the cost structure, if you bring that down 15 or 20%, $50 oil is economic. So you could be in this a good long time. I suspect that certainly for 2015, some people think into 2016 for the overhang. And then that will discourage future investment because there is money on the sidelines right now, but if it's going to take them 2 years to monetize it, they're going to look for other opportunities. I just don't know what other opportunities are out there. On the question of OPEC, I agree with Charlie. I think the OPEC cohesion is gone, but it's gone for a lot of different reasons. We've got producers that are declining. We have producers that are aspirational that are increasing. We've got the light guys versus the heavy guys, two different markets. We've got Shia Sunni, and we've got national competitors. The thought that there could ever be an agreement this fall was, I think, just ludicrous. But there's a couple of big producers in the world, and were we to lose big production from the United States, a 10 million barrel a day producer, Russia, a 10 million barrel a day producer, or Saudi Arabia, that's a third of the market. And there's no amount of shale oil that could make up for a big loss of a big producing, exporting country. So I guess the last point would be that we've seen this before. The virtue of having decades of experience in this is that this isn't our first rodeo, right? So you get to a point where if it's a depletable resource, the time that you don't invest, you're actually begging for a price spike in the future. Because if elasticity is there and demand comes up and the supply is not there to meet it, it's going to take a little bit longer. I agree with Tatiana. It's going to discourage technically complex, high cost, and remote operations. We're definitely not going to see people drilling wells for experimental reasons, like we did in a $100 price. $100 masks a lot of inefficiencies, and I would argue that the 2010 to 2013 period where prices stayed in a band, it was bound on the upside because of anemic global demand and the fear of going into another global recession. And it was bound on the downside because there was so much geopolitical risk out there that folks were afraid. But if some of those countries become secure, they add supply to the market. If economics and demand grows, that increases demand. But it's harder to see the demand side. So you almost have to be pessimistic through this year. Now, it's good for consumers in a lot of different ways. It's probably the natural gas side in the United States. Natural gas prices went down to $1.89. People kept producing. And the wonder of the unconventionals is that these prospects are stacked, especially on the gas side. So we're in what we call the source rock. It generates the hydrocarbons. There's no geologic risk. And once you're in there, in the Marcellus is 5,000 to 7,000 feet. The Utica's below the Marcellus. The Ordovician's below that, and the Mahogany Zone's below that. So you can actually produce from multiple zones. We can drill 6-mile wells, and we can extend laterals for 4.5 miles and hit a target the size of the chair that I'm sitting on. The technology is just spectacular. But then you also have climate change, above ground risks, seismicity, water use, methane emissions that are kind of countervailing. So it's going to be a balancing act. I think we can figure this out, but this is a rough patch for the industry.
Thanks very much.
I'll end on that up note.
Thank you very much. That's given us a lot to think and talk about.
Very good.
I think before opening it up, I'd like to ask one question to Tatiana. We just heard from Charlie and Frank, I think, a sense that oil prices could go down a little bit before they come up, and actually that it could take a while for prices to come back up again. Now, of course, President Putin and the Russian government have basically declared that oil prices will be $70 or $80 by the end of this year. Do you think that will happen? And what will the Russian government do if it doesn't?
Billion-dollar question. Well, I personally think that the prices have good chances to go up, nevertheless, for that simple reason that it seems that OPEC members of OPEC who have really quite different agendas start to doubt whether the policy they've taken was the right policy, and I do not see any unification of their views, which means that it will be more and more difficult for Saudi Arabia to prolong increased oil production. So it could happen, though. From the other hand, I agree with your arguments, and all these accumulated stocks already, they can press downwards on the market. So this year is quite questionable, and if unfortunately for Russia the prices will not increase during this year, during the next year, it will definitely end up in very significant budget cuts for the Russian state budget, which is, for the federal budget, oil revenues, they are providing for about 40% of total budget revenues. 10% approximately are coming from gas exports. And for the total consolidated budget, which includes federal and local budgets, oil provides for about 20% of all revenues. So that's a lot. It's not total dependence like, let's say, in Turkmenistan or in Azerbaijan or in countries or even in Saudi Arabia. Yeah? But it is a very strong dependence, and assuming that the military spendings are now increasing and the population, support for the pensioners, for the teachers, for the doctors, and so on has to be provided just to keep the population more or less calm. It's a significant challenge how to balance with this new shrinking budget through this period of time. But at the same time, I'm afraid, what makes me thinking that the prices will go up is that OPEC members have even more difficult task to solve. So budget cuts, that's the only answer. What else can be done, unfortunately?
Okay, let's open it up for questions. Yes, Rich.
Rich Koslerich from George Mason University. Pick on Tatiana again. Could you say a little bit about the decision to end the South Stream project? And I noticed you were pushing the timeline for moving gas to China way back. It seems to me that the discussion that we've heard to date about Turk Stream and the timing for that gas is very ambitious as well. So I just wondered how you sort of at this point saw those projects sorting out.
Well, it was a very mysterious change, absolutely unexpected by all Russian analysts. But well, it's understandable from that point of view that Russia and Gazprom in particular have spent like 5 years trying to break through with this project without any success. And while they were fixing the situation, let's say in Romania, the situation in Bulgaria was dropping out, and so it was an endless mess. And the resistance from the EU side was so strong that actually investing like 30 billion euros trying to break through this opposition didn't look already like a good project. So the idea to build the pipeline ending on the Turkish territory and then supplying gas and it is specifically stressed by all Gazprom press releases that the gas will be supplied at the Turkish hub. So not even to the Turkish-European border, but at the Turkish hub. It makes a complete change in the whole Gazprom strategy in Europe. So you remember for many years it was trying to expand downstream and to increase its presence in the residential sector to reach the final consumers. Here it's a complete reverse. So stepping back, selling gas not even at the border but a little beyond the border, and taking off any responsibility or any investments on the European territory, because the experience of these investments, like with Opal and Nel, which cannot be settled for a very long period of time, this experience was disappointing. Concerning the volumes and the timeline, so the first string, it is 4 strings of approximately 16 billion cubic meters. So the first string, it simply replaces Russian gas supplied already to Turkey through Ukraine. So it is receiving approximately 10 to 14 BCM through Blue Stream and 16 BCM coming all the way from Ukraine, Romania, and then to Turkey. The second stream actually can be easily utilizing this pipeline system in the reverse flow, supplying Balkans. So actually it's not demanding any construction of the significant new infrastructure. So there could be some expansions of the existing pipelines, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't require huge investments. And as the Turkish stream, according to the latest announcements by Gazprom, is mainly utilizing the sea route which was prepared and geologically explored already for the South Stream, and only the last 200 kilometers have to be planned from the scratch, it means that actually they can start to build it quite fast. So all the pipes are bottle ready. This barge which is laying them is bottle ready. So the personnel is there. They can start construction tomorrow, actually, and preparing at the same time this last miles project. So theoretically, if everything, and as the major part of the investments is spent already, these are sunk investments. So it makes sense to utilize them somehow rather than to throw away all these materials and equipment. So I think that it is doable to bring the first gas to Turkey, let's say in 2017. So it's absolutely, if you look at the schedule of Nord Stream construction, which was followed very strictly. So compared to that, it's quite possible, but it will not mark any change for the European consumers. I mean, it's just a Turkish story. Gas Turkey was receiving through Ukraine or through Turkish stream. Nothing changes. The second line, it could take additional half a year, maybe a bit more, maybe 9 months. But again, it's only for the Balkans. And then I think, and according to the Gazprom's official statements, they do not define the precise dates for the third and the fourth line. So the only thing which Miller says quite clearly is that by 2020 there will be no gas transit through Ukraine. So it is, to my mind, I would say 2021, 2022, so it would require more time, though again usually people are saying Europe will not be able to create the infrastructure necessary to transport this gas on its territory, because Russia is refusing to invest there and Europe doesn't have the desire and the funds for that. Here I wouldn't agree actually, because first of all, a lot of infrastructure already exists there and it has to be expanded. It doesn't have to be built from the like huge pipeline in the middle of nowhere. It's a system of smaller pipelines which could be expanded by adding compressor stations or some loopings, so it's much cheaper. It's really much cheaper. And there is a group of European companies which appeared after unbundling, which didn't exist like 10 years ago. These are TCOs, like Gazuni, Wintershall, Fluxus, for which the main business is to build and utilize pipelines. So if they announce open season and if they have enough bids, they will build it. It's a very good, profitable business for them. They need very low internal rate of return. They are receiving their money through the transportation tariff, and the only thing they need really to start the project is guarantee that gas will be there. So for them, I think it could be an attractive option. They do not need European Commission funding. They do not need anything for that.
Sir, and if you could identify yourself.
Thanks, David Livingston from the Carnegie Endowment. I was just wondering, following up on that, if you could just add a bit of color as well, actually for all three of you, for Charlie and Frank as well, on what you think the implications of this gas glut, Turk Stream are for the renegotiation of oil-linked gas contracts over the next 5-7 years.
you want to start?
The oil contracts have been already very strongly renegotiated. We made a special chart looking at the Gazprom's financial reports, quarterly financial reports. They contain, in fact, a lot of useful information. 53 contracts were negotiated 4 or 5 times. So actually the real price which Gazprom was receiving from its European customers by the end of 2014 was approximately 20% lower than the traditional oil-linked price. So the discount was already very significant. Now with the oil price going down, and it will be, this decline in oil price is not yet visible completely in the Gazprom's price because of this time lag. So by April, by May, Gazprom's prices will reach like $6.57 per BTU, which is below hub prices. So I don't think that any customers will be really very eager to renegotiate and to ask for hub prices. And then it will depend actually for how long the oil prices will stay at such low levels. But I mean, the incentive, this gap between hub prices and oil-linked prices, it is disappearing. And so the whole discussion is losing its tension. At the same time, I think that in the longer term, it's, I mean, all this story with the Turkish stream and Turkish hub, and from the other hand, all the story with the St. Petersburg gas exchange, which is being very strongly promoted by the government and which has special departments for international logistics and international payments, it could mark, it's my guess, but at least I see some logics behind that, it could mark a preparation for a new stage of the Russian export strategy, maybe post-2020, when all these projects are built and when the St. Petersburg exchange starts to function properly, to move to the spot pricing, could be, but the spot pricing will be based not in Western European hubs, but on the hubs on the Russian territory or Turkish territory, with a lower number of market participants and with a good opportunity to influence prices. So it could change quite considerably the whole strategy.
I would just add that on the short, so the short term affects the midterm affects the long term. I think Tatiana is absolutely right that if you look at the time lag, by the time you get to May, the oil-linked contracts are going to be so low that diversification objectives, I think, are going to be at risk, that the contract price may be lower than the spot gas price. And if you look at U.S. gas at $3 and add $5 regas liquefaction and transport fees, that's above $8 already, right? So the odds of a lot of other places flowing into Europe where you can make money, it also puts pressure on places like East Africa that thought when they were going into this there wouldn't be an oversupplied market, that Europe, if it diversified, would open up opportunities. But it's going to be a tough competition, and the dollars spent bringing those projects on that were already invested in country, they're expensive projects, right? So you still have to make some money in order to build out the projects and deliver them. That's why I think a lot of people feel U.S. gas, when it starts flowing, flows to Asia, not Europe.
I would only add that I think the LNG market's in big trouble, particularly after 2020 when the Australian projects start coming in droves. You know, those projects probably already have become uneconomic, although they've got contracts and sunk costs, so they're going to move the gas. But, you know, one of those projects is estimated to already be up close to $70 billion. And it's why in the reports we've done at Brookings, we do not believe that this great exponential rise in U.S. LNG exports is ever going to occur, at least within the next decade. And I would stick by the fact that we still think, you know, you're not going to see more than 6, 7 LNG projects. And regardless of what the government does to approve them, you've got to get them financed. And Finn and Sears, we believe, looking at the market that these newer projects would be coming into, we think will balk And so the idea that U.S. is going to be the great savior of Europe for dependence on Russian gas, we think is a pipe dream.
We have a colleague, Feridun Fesharaki, many of you know. So Feridun has said that for U.S. LNG projects, they need 3 permits. They need FERC, DOE, and Adam Smith. And if the economics don't work, no one builds them.
Very good. My colleague Jeffrey Kemp.
You can use it.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, panel. I think it was, if you'd been here 5 years ago, no one was talking about shale revolution. Maybe it was 6 years, but this suddenly came on the average citizen and on the world as a huge surprise, and this has been a game changer. So in thinking ahead about what other sorts of technologies could happen that we currently don't have on the radar scope, could you be a little creative and talk about alternatives? I mean, Bob Manning and I were discussing at lunch how slow it's been to develop more efficient batteries for everything. But I mean, if there were a breakthrough in battery technology, if there were a breakthrough in all sorts of other efficiencies in the energy market, this would further, it seems to me, diminish the demand that you've been talking about. So could you be creative and give us something to speculate about?
So I think storage is the obvious one for power generation, right? If we could do that, then you could deal with renewables without having the fluctuations when the sun doesn't shine. There was a discussion yesterday. We were talking about an eclipse in Europe. What does that do to solar? You know, I mean, this is a couple-hour event, but it's a big concern now.
Big concern.
It's a big concern. Nuclear, low-price gas has priced nuclear out when that's probably the only way that you meet the climate objectives. So we've got to find a way to bring that back in the mix. Efficiencies get done. This extra natural gas, I think, buys us time and may also be a source of hydrogen that we could do other things with. I do think that low oil and gas prices perpetuate a fossil fuel future longer, which makes the climate lift a little bit harder.
I would only add, and they're nowhere near economic, and some people would say they never will be, but I would add probably the most important, if we could do it, prove both technically and commercially that it's feasible to capture carbon from coal and potentially from gas, that would be transformative, because obviously there are a lot of countries that we don't want them to use more coal, and they're going to use more coal, so unless we find a way to shift that. I'm a great advocate of small-scale modular reactors, but they too have not caught on and are probably still certainly not competitive in the market we have today with low-cost gas. The hydrogen fuel cycle we've been talking about for years, and if we can do it, that's a game changer. And you know, the Japanese are big on trying to develop methane hydrates, but God help them in terms of cost, and it's not clear there aren't some downside environmental implications of that.
Methane emissions.
Methane emissions. But I think, you know, and we've all talked about fusion, but you know, fusion's always 30 years away, and it's been 30 years away every year of my life, and it's still 30 years away. But those are, you know, I don't think we have, obviously, Jeffrey, somebody's going to find something even more exotic that we aren't even thinking about. But I think we know enough about the technologies that are at least feasible if we can just find a way to get the cost and prove they can be commercialized.
I'm reluctant to put anybody in the audience on the spot, but we do have somebody who just wrote a book about one of these technologies with us, Levi Tilleman, who just wrote a book on new automotive technologies. Do you have any input on this point?
Well, I thought, like Tatiana was saying about the oil companies and how they were delinked from the actual price of oil was kind of interesting, because there's a sort of correlated policy in California in terms of innovation for electric vehicles. So I wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post about a month ago that was addressing the question of will low gas prices kill the electric car? And the answer is no, because there's actually a system that has been implemented by California and a number of the other states in the country, about 7 other states, that represent 25% of the U.S. vehicles market. And that system basically has created a market for electric vehicles that is somewhat delinked from the oil prices. And the reason that is because every time you sell an electric car in any one of those states, you get a credit for that. And those credits are required from a regulatory standpoint in each of these states, and they're bought and sold between the auto companies. So if sales of those credits go down, that means the price of the credits go up. And that means that there's actually kind of a shock absorber that is built into the market for electric vehicles. So we have, at least 3.3 million electric vehicles coming online by year 2025 in the United States, and that's a floor, not a ceiling. So we will see, some significant level of demand destruction in terms of automotive fuel consumption coming from electric cars.
Thank you very much for that. Anybody else?
Could I just add that
Yeah,
his book is one of the finest books. And if you haven't read it, you certainly should do so.
Hello, Annette Heuser, Bertelsmann Foundation. I have a question for Charles and Frank, because probably Tatiana doesn't feel comfortable to answer this question. It's related to the sanctions. And as Tatiana indicated, so far we can't, or we don't see an effect, a real effect, on the EU sanctions in place towards the Russian energy market. So if you've been called in by the EU foreign ministers right now in Brussels and been asked, what can we envision right now in order to have maybe more sanctions in place when it comes to the energy sector that would have a binding effect? What would be your answer?
Go alphabetical. So on the sanctions piece, I really think it's a two-edged sword. It's become the tool of choice, right? And my concern is it's this economic statecraft that we get too far down the road. Let me back up a little bit. If it wasn't for when we put in place Iran sanctions, right? I think the 3 considerations, not giving away the store here, were that we wanted something meaningful enough to bring Iran to the table. We wanted something demonstrably significant enough so that the Israelis didn't launch a preemptive attack that took us out of the negotiations. And we needed to keep, if you remember the time frame, oil prices below $120 thereabouts, because the concern was the global economy would go back in the toilet. Right? We basically were able to do that, in part because of a rise in new production, in part because demand was slow. The thought of doing Russia sanctions and Iran sanctions at the same time in a high price environment would have been impossible. But this low price has given us the leverage to do that. My concern is that if you go the next phase, and I actually think we will go the next phase, because if you believe that the purpose of the sanctions is to moderate behavior, it hasn't happened. And I'm not sure it will happen. And if it doesn't happen and you just keep ramping them up, I think 2 things do happen. And one is that you develop within Russia a separate line of services and skill sets to start replacing things that they've lost from either Europe or the West. That you may develop a new financing scheme, hard to imagine now because the dollar-denominated scheme and Western banks are so prevalent around the world, but you could see a time that if you start pushing potential enemies together, do you create alliances down the road that you really don't like to do? And then the third piece is it pushed to the point where it's destabilizing? One of I can get you to $70 of oil at the end of the year, but it posits a situation where there's a disruption or instability in some country. And whether that's internally because the government can't deal with the low prices and still feed the needs of the people, or it's done externally by another actor that doesn't like low prices, and it's unstable enough to cause disruption, which then elevates the price. But then how long do you live in that world? I would argue that in 2008, $12 gas and $150 oil is what spurred a lot of these people to take chances and experiment and produce. If we get back to $95, there's a lot of cash and a lot of technology now sitting on the sidelines where countries will come in and then bring in the oversupply if the demand elasticity doesn't emerge, right? So I just think you need to, the reaction is, it's not working, ratchet down harder. I'm not sure in this case it works because some of the outcomes may be less desirable than we really plan on.
I hesitate to say this, and I apologize to any Europeans in the room. I will say what Frank said, beware of what you wish for by doing what I'm about to advocate, because it could have negative reverberations that we might not even contemplate at the moment. But it seems to me from the beginning that if we were really serious and we wanted to send Mr. Putin and his oligarchs a clear message, we would get very serious about going after their illegal assets in German, British, and French banks, and perhaps their real estate investments in Mayfair and the Riviera. But the very fact that we have chosen as an alliance not to do that suggests to me that we are not serious in really wanting to confront. And it is a fair question if we did that and it had a negative impact on the Russian economy or on individuals. It is a fair question to ask, do we really want to destabilize Russia in that sense? Because with Mr. Putin in power, we don't know what the reaction would be, and I would suggest it might be what we don't want to see, which is a further striking out in a way that I don't think the West is also prepared to address.
You know, I would just kind of make maybe one observation on the point about assets, you know, which is that the Russian government has been already strongly encouraging a lot of them to bring their assets back with admittedly mixed success, because there's some coming back and there's also a lot going out to other places. The challenge with that, from my point of view as a policy, is that there's just a fundamental difference between Russia and Ukraine. And that approach basically worked in Ukraine in getting Yanukovych out of office by taking a lot of his supporters away, because in Ukraine, oligarchs were politically active and influential. And, you know, there were basically a small number of people who sort of owned the Party of Regents in the Ukrainian parliament. And it was possible for the United States and our European allies to talk to those people and to get them to withdraw their support from Yanukovych. In the Russian case, oligarchs were tamed by Putin 15 years ago. Almost right after he came into office as one of his highest priorities when he came into office. And it may be actually that by threatening the oligarchs, what you actually do is drive a lot of their money back into Russia, making them even more subject to Putin's leverage and influence. And actually focusing the attention of the Russian security services much more closely on those people, because now they are questioning their loyalty and they deserve special observation and supervision. So I think there's a certain appeal to that approach, but I would personally have questions about to what extent it would work. I'd be really interested, though, Tatiana, in your reaction to something that Frank said, which is, you know, the possibility that an external actor who didn't like low oil prices might try to do something that would increase oil prices. Do you think that there are circumstances under which the Russian government would try to do something like that? And if so, what would be required to make the Kremlin think seriously about that kind of action?
Don't feel any pressure.
Well, tricky question, yeah. But I mean, well, low oil price, it's a big problem, definitely, and I think if it really lasts for a long period of time, more than a year and a half, more than 2 years, then obviously there will be some active actions. Action number one, which actually Russia tried initially, was talking with OPEC. And in, I think it was October 2014, there was a meeting by the Russian energy minister, by Igor Sechin, with OPEC representatives. So they didn't find a common language, but it was just the beginning of the oil price collapse. So it was the early stage when OPEC was absolutely relaxed, saying, no, 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 everybody will die, we will survive. Yeah, I think after a year or two they will change their attitude. So some sort of negotiations theoretically are becoming more possible. Well, I don't think that actually takes too much effort to destabilize situation in the Middle East. If anybody wants to do it, it's like it's already like a bomb. You just need to. But I hope it won't go so far, because again, it's in nobody's interest. This whole sanctions spiral and this whole spiral of mutual, not just distrust, but trying to hurt as much as possible. Yeah, I'm afraid if it really goes on this way, it will not end up peacefully, it will not end up with any positive outcome. I'm afraid that people here in the West do not realize that actually by introducing new and new sanctions, trying to not just punish Russia, just to call it for, let's say, inappropriate behavior, yeah, it is in fact increasing this feeling with the Russian population that we are surrounded by the enemies who want to destroy us. Putin is our president, we are supporting him because he is trying to protect us from this external aggression. And so actually from the society which was rather politically neutral and with mainly focused on its personal consumption, now the society is becoming much, much more mobilized, politicized, and supportive to this hard line in the external politics. So the result is, as far as I understand, absolutely opposite to what the sanctions were initially introduced for. And I mean, if we were talking about a small country in the middle of nowhere, it's okay, but we are talking about huge country with the incredible regional influence, with the nuclear weapons, with the regular missiles. So it's not funny already, and it's the way it is developing is frankly frightening me.
Harley.
Very interesting.
Harley Balzer.
Thank you. Harley Balzer, Georgetown University. Paul, the one thing I've seen along the lines of what you're asking about, and I have to go back and check my notes on this because I've got a file for wacko responses, was that if Russians were cut out of SWIFT, they would have the Iranians take care of the Saudi oil fields. And that was filed. The person saying it said we would do an asymmetrical response, which harks back to old Civil War language. But my question really is for Tatiana, and it's really Alexei Kudrin's question. A decade or so ago when the Baker Institute ranked world oil companies, Rosneft was near the bottom. Mm-hmm. They took over Yukos, one of the most efficient producers. Production numbers have not looked all that good. They've now acquired the chunk of TNK-BP. They've now acquired Bashneft. You would think in a time of declining prices you want to be more efficient rather than having a less efficient company picking up the other producers. Can you shed any light on what the thinking is?
It's the matter of very strong discussions inside Russia. So Rosneft was indeed showing amazing appetite for mergers and acquisitions during the last years, and it's not just oil business, it's airports, it's a lot of infrastructure, it's everything they can reach. Yeah? But there is, when we are discussing energy strategy, one of the most important arguments we are making for the oil sector is that we need to develop smaller independent oil producing companies, because they are bringing innovations, and because the resource base is actually changing dramatically compared to the Soviet time, when we had just a few very large fields with a huge economy of scale, which it made sense to develop with huge companies. Now it's a set of very small, complicated fields, and the further the industry is developing, the more complicated assets it has to produce. So independents are really, really welcomed, at least in rhetorics, but you have to create a proper institutional environment for them, and first of all to protect them from the threat of being eaten by Rosneft. Yeah, so, but Rosneft definitely has a very strong lobbying power. It's half of Russian production, and it's Igor Sechin as CEO, so it has high potential. It is, I would say that the financial difficulties it is facing now, and first of all this need to repay debts, they are already slowing down their appetite. So I think that the problems with the access to the financial market will limit their further activities in acquisitions, though the problem of corporate management in the assets they've got already, it's there. Rosneft is the only Russian oil company which demonstrated a decline in oil production in 2014. And though they pretend that it's just the result of the sanctions, we understand that it's also the problem of the management. The company is too big compared to what it can manage efficiently. So probably they would be able to put it all together and to increase the efficiency to deliver this synergy with the Tinka BP management that they promised to deliver, but it will take time. So far it's not visible yet. And still they love ambitious projects. That's the problem of all Russian oil and gas business, this taste for mega projects, no matter how efficient they are. But it's okay with $110 per barrel oil, but with $55 you cannot afford such things. You should focus more on efficiency, not on the volumes. And that's something Russian oil industry is trying now to receive, to understand, but it will take time.
I mentioned Levi's book. I should mention, after Harley's comment about Iran and Saudi Arabia, the book by my colleagues Jeffrey Kemp and John Gay, who are both in the room, which, if I recall correctly, actually included an assessment of Iran's options in attacking Saudi oil fields. Jeff, do you want to say anything? That's a little bit of a detour, but John?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, well, it's certainly a possibility. The other angle that the Iranians have been talking about lately, I'm not sure many people are taking it too seriously. Khamenei had talked about taking Iranian, I think it was Iranian gas, off of the market, possibly Iranian oil as well, saying that if the West wants to sanction us, we'll sanction them right back. But I haven't heard anybody yet taking that very seriously. They do have some financial tools that allow them to take some hits, but I don't think they could do that for very long. So
thanks, John. Dan Russell, and then sorry.
Hi, Dan Russell, U.S.-Russia Business Council. Hi, Tatiana. Look, a lot of liberal Russian economists have hoped for a good crisis for a long time to try to get back to the structural reform that the economy needs. And obviously, we're not going to see that right now as people try to hunker down and survive this period. But looking ahead, if things get tighter, what's the one structural reform that you think would be key in the oil and gas sector that would help to get the oil and gas sector back on the road to wellness and to a growth model?
Really good question. You see, I don't think that it is tax reform, unfortunately. So it's important, but it will not save the industry. There is no simple remedy. That's something we found out when we were making numerous model runs for the energy strategy. I mean, simple things do not work. You have to change the whole institutional framework. Independent courts, property rights, all these things, which are going far beyond the oil and gas sector itself. So it is, I mean, you can prolong its current functioning with the current levels if you make some of the technologies more available, but it is not solving the overall problems which were accumulated during the last like 15 years. Yeah. And we understand that actually the production levels which Russian oil companies are demonstrating now, their basics were created in the early 2000s when private companies were dominating the market and investing hardly in the new technologies. And now under the more state control, they are receiving the fruits of those investments made like 5, 7, 8 years ago. So now we have to create the basic for the next investments, for the next results. And I'm afraid, frankly speaking, that the whole reform agenda in Russia, which is raised by liberal economists from time to time, it's still lacking any clear vision. What are we talking about? Because, I mean, the country which is finding itself in the position of Russia fortress, protecting itself against external enemies, speaking about the entrepreneurial activity and freedom of investment and open market and attracting investments and all these things which are usually helping to increase economic activity, it doesn't match. So it's more and more actually shifting to the centralized, government-controlled economics, mobilization economics, because again we have to survive, as you mentioned. It's more the psychology of survival rather than psychology of building an open investment climate, so, unfortunately.
Thank you very much, sir.
Well, just a follow-up question, I think. First of all, thank you for sharing your knowledge and clarity. I have a very banal question, and excuse my ignorance. What is the ratio between the cost of production per barrel and the price in Russia currently?
Mm-hmm. Well, it depends, of course, on the particular field you are talking about, but the lifting costs are in the range of $10 to $18 per barrel. So mainly Soviet legacy fields, they are $10 to $11 per barrel, very low. The new fields where you have to implement horizontal drilling and some fracturing, so more complicated, or the deeper horizons of the old fields, it could be 15, 18, approaching $20 per barrel. But actually, Rosneft, Lukoil are among the companies, publicly traded companies, with the lowest production costs globally. So they are quite competitive.
General, could I take you out of your lane a little bit?
but you seem to know so much about so many things, you probably know the answer to this. Putin has done some pretty remarkable increases in his military. Putin has done some pretty remarkable things with military spending since about 2007. If we're right here that the price of oil comes down to the high 30s, or even if it stays in the $50 or $60 range, will he be able to keep the acceleration in his military spending? And if so, and here's the real question, out of which other sectors will he have to take money to do that? And what will that kind of an effect have on the Russian economy?
I'm afraid it's already not a question whether military expenditures will increase. It's already announced more or less, and the whole situation is pushing for increased spendings. And yeah, if oil price will remain low or even go to $30 per barrel, that would mean that some of the social expenditures will have to be cut. I don't think that anybody is going to cut them directly, but it will inevitably result in further ruble depreciation. So in nominal terms, the expenditures will be the same. So teachers and doctors will receive the same money, and pensioners will receive the same money in nominal terms. But in real terms, their revenues will decline, and part of them will be just sent for the military things. But as I've mentioned already, this whole peculiarity of mobilization economy is that population supports it. Just for your information, during the last year, average Russian citizen has lost approximately 50% of his revenues, personal revenues, in dollar terms. Do you see any opposition? I mean, you know these polls concerning the support of the government of Putin personally. People are proud to live in the great country. They are satisfied with Crimea. They support this external policy. Okay, they've sacrificed part of their personal incomes, but there are things more important than that. And this mobilization psychology, it's being developed, it's being exploited more and more.
You know, I don't want to step out of my own territory here, but I would just make a political observation, setting aside the economics of it. And the political observation I would make is that the military, the security services, and the defense industrial complex are part of President Putin's core political constituency in Russia. And it's not just a question of necessarily maintaining or increasing military spending because there's a threat from NATO or because it's a time of crisis or something like that, but this is actually a political constituency inside the country that Putin, I would say more than any other, needs to focus on and keep the support of. And I guess what I would say on the flip side of that is, you know, notwithstanding the current political environment and support for his action in Crimea and sort of this rallying behind Putin, I would say that the locus of discontent before that situation was with the urban middle class. And if I were kind of a calculating political leader in that country, I would be much more focused on accommodating the military, the security services, the defense industrial complex, and I would worry a lot less about the needs and preferences of the urban middle class, many of whom probably don't really support me that much anyway. That's just my observation. Frank or Charlie, do you have any closing thoughts?
No, I'm fine.
I'll leave it as upbeat as we.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for coming. I think it was.